So, hey, everybody. Welcome to part two of The Limits of Power. Introduction, War Without Exits. We left off on page 7, and so we're going to start at the top of page 8 here where it says after 9/11, right? And so, thus, I will begin. After 9/11, they combined to produce a Bush administration's War of No Exits and No Deadlines. Highlight this. President Bush has likened today's war against what he calls Islamofascism to America's war with Nazi Germany, a great struggle waged on behalf of liberty. Stop there. And now, listen, this, we kind of alluded to this in part 1. Whenever you want the American public to be completely behind something, you compare it to World War II. Because no one is ever going to say Hitler was a good guy unless you're a neo-Nazi, right? And if you are, red flag, I got to call somebody, all right? No one's ever going to say the Nazis were good. And no one's ever going to say that World War II was bad, right? Hey, defeated pure evil in the world, freedom for everyone, World War II, you're welcome, right? You know what I mean? And so you got to understand that Americans were fickle. We forget things quickly, right? And with a war without exits, with this idea that the war on terrorism was going to last indefinitely, they need the American public to support it after the memories of 9/11 fade away, especially with a generation that won't have any 9/11 memories like you guys, right? And so what do? You compare it to World War II. You say the war on terror is just like World War II. It is good and just, and you better get behind it or you're a communist, right? Or you're a terrorist supporter. Do you like terrorism? Then you better not. Then you better not say anything about the war on terror, right? Otherwise, you like terrorism. Like, it's one of those types of arguments, right? We still compare things to World War II. Like, compare what's going on now with the movement and the efforts to justifiably so, I would argue, stay at home during what's going on right now. The sacrifices you're making are similar to the sacrifices that they made in World War II. It's the same strategy, because no one's ever going to say that World War II wasn't a good thing, and that what we sacrificed to make World War II victorious, or end in victory, I should say, wasn't good, right? So keep that in mind. All right. The President Bush is waging his global war on terror to preserve American freedom is no doubt the case. Yet that commitment, however well-intentioned, begs several larger questions. As actually expressed and experienced, what is freedom today? What is its content? And at what cost does the exercise of freedom impose? And more importantly, who pays? These are fundamental questions which cannot be dismissed or the rhetorical wave of the hand. Great wartime presidents of the past, one thinks especially of Abraham Lincoln speaking at Gettysburg, have not hesitated to confront such questions directly. The President Bush seems oblivious to their very existence, offers one measure of his shortcomings as a statesman. Freedom is not static, nor is it necessarily benign. In practice, freedom constantly evolves, and in doing so, generates new requirements and abolishes old constraints. The common understanding of freedom that prevailed in December 1941 when the United States entered war against the Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany has long since become obsolete. In some respects, this must be cause for celebration. In others, it might be cause for regret. Highlight this. The changes have been both qualitative and quantitative. In many respects, Americans are freer today than ever before, with more citizens ever before enjoying unencumbered access to the promise of American life. Stop there. Yet, especially since the 1960s, the reinterpretation of freedom has had more transformative impact on our society and culture. The transformation has produced a paradoxical legacy. As individuals, our appetites and expectations have grown exponentially. Highlight this. Niebuhr once wrote disapprovingly of Americans, their culture soft and vulgar, equating joy with happiness and happiness with comfort. Were he alive today, Niebuhr might amend that judgment, with Americans increasingly equating comfort with self-indulgence. Stop there. And so what does he mean by that? What he's kind of beginning to say, when we talked about this, right? If you're going to be middle class, how many cars do you have to own? Like, we've talked about this, I'm pretty sure. And the answer is now you have to own 2. Well, back in the 50s, how many did you have to own? 1. How do we know that's changed in society? If you go and want to build an apartment complex, you have to have the land for parking space for 2 cars per unit that you have in the apartment complex, because it is expected that the average family has 2 cars, right? And so what we're starting to become as a society, and some are arguing that maybe the pandemic will change this concept. I don't know if it will, because again, we're fickle and we forget things quickly, is the idea that we now essentially have acquainted comfort with owning more stuff, right? And the more stuff we own, the more comfortable we are in our minds. And therefore, it has raised what it means to be lower class, middle class, upper middle class, and wealthy, right? Like, to the point where, okay, and this is why it's hurting us, argument being, I grew up comfortably middle class. And I picked a profession that is going to essentially keep me comfortable middle class if I make smart financial decisions, right? Which I hope I have. And so the point is this, okay? But I'm still just middle class, right? The problem is this. I have to spend twice as much money to be middle class as my parents did, right? You know what I mean? And I'm going to have to spend 2 to 3 times as much money to make sure my son Augustus has a middle class lifestyle than my parents had to for me, right? Like, what's a classic example of this? Cars in the parking lot at the high school, right? Like, how everybody complains about lack of parking space now? All right. When I was in high school, there was no concern of lack of parking space, and we didn't have Griffin Street parking lot, right? I had like 1 car available for every 5 friends, right? You know what I mean? Like, no one had a car. And so me not having a car, though, didn't mean I wasn't middle class. I was middle class, okay? And now I almost think, and I would think there's an argument to be made, that for a high school kid to be considered middle class, he has to have a car when he gets his driver's license, or she, right? Does that make sense? Because that would be like the example we're getting at here, or that Basevich is getting at. Okay. The collective capacity of our domestic political economy to satisfy those appetites has not kept pace with demand. As a result, sustaining our pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness at home requires increasingly that Americans look beyond our borders. Where the issue at hand is oil, credit, or the availability of cheap consumer goods, we expect the world to accommodate the American way of life, right? Like, we want cheap consumer goods. In America, those things don't exist because our employees in factories demand living wages, right? So where do we get cheap products? China, right? Or other areas where the minimum wage for daily labor isn't as much, and therefore the price of the product goes down, and we're happy with that, right? That's what he means by that. So we're having to expand, right? And now we're competing with other countries that are getting into that first world nation status too, that capitalistic first world nation status, like China, growing middle class in India, and there's demand for that, right? There's demand for oil. Well, there used to be. It's in the negatives now, but let's pretend that we're not in the middle of a pandemic. There's demands for all those things that to be middle class, and everybody, even in developing nations, realize that to be middle class, just like we think, you have to have stuff, right? And so I need stuff, and we need raw materials to build that stuff. And so as more people pull from that raw material pool, prices go up, it becomes more expensive. Does everybody pick up what I'm putting down there? Okay. All right. The resulting sense of entitlement has great implications for the foreign policy. Simply put, as the American appetite for freedom has grown, so too has our penchant for empire. Highlight this. The connection between these two tendencies is a casual one. Stop there. In an earlier age, Americans saw empire as the antithesis of freedom. Today, as illustrated above by all the Bush administration's efforts to dominate the energy-rich Persian Gulf, empire has seemingly become a prerequisite of freedom. There is a further paradox. The actual exercise of American freedom is no longer conducive to generating the power required to establish and maintain an imperial order. If anything, the reverse is true. Centered on consumption and an individual autonomy, the exercise of freedom is contributing to a gradual erosion of our national power. At precisely the moment when the ability to wield power, especially military power, has become the sine qua non for preserving American freedom, our reserves of power are being depleted. One sees this, for example, in the way that heightened claim of individual autonomy have eviscerated the concept of citizenship. Highlight this. Yesterday's civic obligations have become today's civic options. What was once rated as duties, rallying to the country's defense at a time of great emergency, for example, are now matters of choice. Stop there. As individuals, Americans never cease to expect more. As members of community, especially as members of national community, they choose to contribute less. Meanwhile, American political leaders, especially at the national level, have proven unable, and you should be stopping highlighting if we have not, unable or unwilling to address the disparity between how much we want and what we can afford to pay. Successive administrations, abetted by the Congress, have deepened a looming crisis of debt and dependency through unbridled spending. As Vice President Dick Cheney, a self-described conservative, announced when told that cutting taxes might be at odds with invading Iraq, deficits don't matter. Politicians of both parties certainly act as if they don't. Highlight this. Expectations that the world beyond our borders should accommodate the American way of life are hardly new. Since 9/11, however, our demands have become more insistent. Stop there. In that regard, the neoconservative writer Robert Kagan is surely correct in observing that America did not change on September 11th. It only became more itself. In the aftermath of the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, Washington's resolve that nothing interfere with the individual American's pursuit of liberty, life, liberty, and happiness only hardened. That resolve found expression in the Bush administration's with us or against us rhetoric, in its disdain for the United Nations and traditional American allies, in its contempt for international law, and above all, in its embrace of preventative war. When President Bush declared in his second inaugural address that the survival of liberty in our lands increasingly depend on the success of liberty in other lands, he was in effect claiming that for the United States as freedom's chief agent, the prerogative of waging war when and where it sees fit, those wars by definition being fought on freedom's behalf. Highlight this. In this sense, the long war genuinely qualifies as a war to preserve the American way of life, centered on a specific conception of liberty, and simultaneously as a war to extend an American empire. Stop there. Centered on dreams of a world remade in America's image, the former widely assumed to require the latter. Yet as events have been made plain, the United States is ill-prepared to wage a global war of no exits and no deadlines. Highlight this. The sole superpower lacks the resources, economic, political, and military, to support a large-scale, protracted conflict without, at the very least, inflicting severe economic and political damage on itself. Stop there. American power has limits, and it is inadequate to the ambitions to which hubris and sanctimony have given rise. Here's the central paradox of our time. This is the one. Buckle this in. Lock in. Okay? Highlight this. While the defense of American freedom seems to demand that the U.S. troops fight in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, the exercise of that freedom at home undermines the nation's capacity to fight. Stop there. And so what they're going to get at here is think about it like this. When we've talked about this in the past, the military-industrial complex. All right? And so what ends up happening is World War II and every war prior to World War II, the nation stops everything it's doing and it goes to war. Everyone sacrifices. Everyone commits themselves to the war effort, whether it's collecting scrap metal to a factory stopping, making its consumer product and making a war product, to rationing food at grocery stores. Everything stops, right? Well, that's because we needed the nation to create the stuff we needed to fight the war. Now, after World War II, we have the military-industrial complex. And we've talked about this. We have companies that just make stuff to fight wars, right? Well, what that means is we, as a society, when we fight a war now, also need to keep our capitalist consumer economy thriving. And if we don't, we go into a recession, right? Like, so as we're paying for the tanks and the planes and the soldiers and the gas, which is the most expensive part of a war, and all that type of stuff, we also still need to go buy a new car. We also still need to buy, I don't know, Blu-rays. You know what I mean? We still need to buy iPods because it's 2003. We still, then we would get it. But, we need to buy the latest iPhone. We need to buy all these things to keep the consumer economy going. And so this creates an issue where American debt goes up. We enter the position of a recession. And at the same time, we don't end up having to sacrifice to demand that a conflict have a resolution to it, right? That the war that we're fighting have a distinct goal, have a distinct end, right? That's the issue. And that's the problem with the war on terror, right? Because this isn't a conventional war of that country is over there with defined borders, with a defined leadership role, with a defined army that we're going to go fight, and then we're going to defeat them, and then we're going to make a treaty, and then everybody's going to abide by that treaty, and then we're done. Terrorism and war on terror doesn't work like that, and that's a problem, right? Does everybody get that? Okay. So you should have stopped, you should have highlighted while the defense of America all the way to capacity to fight, and stop there. A grand bazaar provides an adequate basis upon which to erect a vast empire. Meanwhile, a stubborn insistence on staying the course militarily ends up jeopardizing freedom at home. With Americans, even in wartime, refusing to curb their appetites, the long war aggravates the economic contradictions that continue to produce debt and dependency. Moreover, a state of perpetual national security emergency aggravates the disorders afflicting our political system, allowing the executive branch to accrue even ever more authority at the expense of the Congress and disfiguring the Constitution. In this sense, the long war is both self-defeating and irrational. Niebuhr once wrote, "One of the most pathetic aspects of human history is that every civilization expresses itself most pretentiously, compounding its partial and universal values most convincingly, and claiming immortality for its finite existence at the very moment when the decay which leads to death has already begun." They're essentially saying, whenever empires or countries and empires and throughout history have ever said, we're going to last forever, they're actually already in decline, right? Future generations of historians may well cite Niebuhr's dictum as a concise explanation of the folly that propelled the United States into its long war. Beverage pause. In an immediate sense, it is the soldier who bears the burden of such folly. U.S. troops in battle dress and body armor, whom Americans profess to admire and support, pay the price for the nation's collective refusal to confront our domestic dysfunction. In many ways, the condition of the military today offers the most urgent expression of that dysfunction. 7 years into its confrontation with the radical Islam, the United States finds itself with too much war for too few warriors, and with no prospect of producing the additional soldiers needed to close the gap. In effect, Americans now confront a looming military crisis to go along with the economic and political crises that they have labored so earnestly to ignore. The Iraq War deserves our attention as the clearest manifestation of these three crises, demonstrating the extent to which they are inextricably linked and mutually reinforcing. That war was always necessary, except in the eyes of the deluded and the disingenuous. It has long since become a fool's errand. Of perhaps even greater significance, it is both counterproductive and unsustainable. Highlight this. Yet ironically, Iraq may yet prove to be the source of our salvation. For the United States, the ongoing war makes plain the imperative of putting America's house in order. Stop there. Iraq has revealed the futility of counting on military power to sustain our habits of profligacy. If you're wondering, by the way, I probably should have defined this earlier. Profligacy means gross self-indulgence. Like the idea that I drive a Ford F-150 0.5 miles to the building where my wife also works, and she takes her own car, right? And that truck gets 16 miles to the gallon, right? But I'm going to because it's America, and I'm a middle-class, thriving America, all right? You know what I mean? American, all right? And it's that kind of idea. We're all guilty of it, right? It's one of those things. Iraq revealed I'm sorry, I already read that part. The day of reckoning approaches. Expending the lives of more American soldiers in hopes of deferring that day is profoundly wrong. History will not judge kindly of people who find nothing amiss in the prospect of endless armed conflict so long as they themselves are spared the effects. Nor will it view with favor an electorate that delivers political power into the hands of leaders unable to envision any alternative but to perpetual war. Highlight this. Rather than insisting that the world accommodate the United States, Americans need to reassert control over their own destiny, ending their condition of dependency and abandoning their imperial delusions. Stop there. Of perhaps even greater difficulty, the combination of economic, political, and military crisis summons Americans to re-examine exactly what freedom entails. Soldiers cannot accomplish these tasks, nor should we expect politicians to do so. The onus of responsibility falls squarely on the citizenry, aka, if you don't like them in, vote them out. All right? Now, spoiler alert, as I mentioned in my email to you, the parts that you highlight are the answers to the questions that you need to fill out for this week's assignment. All right? So I hope that this is not super confusing. Maybe we'll hold something this week at some point. I can take some questions if you have any of them. Won't be a necessary thing. You know what I mean? But other than that, hey, there it is, the introduction. We're going to continue on with this kind of through phase 3 a little bit, and we'll see where we're at. I miss all of you, and I love you, and I hope to see you soon. All right? See ya.